Picture this. It's dawn in medieval Paris, and while most of the city sleeps, Thomas the Gravedigger is already at work in the cemetery of the Holy Innocents, his shovel breaking through soil that's been frozen solid for weeks. Around him, dozens of fresh graves wait to be filled from the previous day's deaths, while new burial orders pile up faster than he can complete them. This isn't unusual for winter in the city, but it's not the romantic, mysterious scene that modern people imagine. Thomas works with methodical efficiency, checking soil conditions, calculating grave depths, and planning his day around the complex logistics of medieval burial. His hands are cracked from cold and constant digging, his back aches from years of manual labor, and his social life is limited by the fact that most people avoid those who work so closely with death. Yet he's an essential craftsman, whose skills keep the city functioning, and his work requires more technical knowledge and social sensitivity than most people realize. The daily life of a medieval gravedigger was far more complex and demanding than simply digging holes in the ground. These were skilled craftsmen who combined physical labor with technical expertise, social diplomacy, and psychological resilience to provide essential services that kept medieval communities functioning during both ordinary times and crisis periods, when death rates soared beyond normal capacity to manage the dead. Medieval gravediggers began their workdays before sunrise, using the cool morning hours for the most physically demanding aspects of their profession, while planning their schedules around the complex logistics of medieval burial practices. They needed to coordinate with families, religious authorities, and municipal officials while managing the practical challenges of soil conditions, weather, and cemetery space allocation that could affect every aspect of their work. The physical demands of medieval grave digging were extraordinary and required specialized techniques that varied dramatically based on season, soil conditions, and local burial customs. Winter graves had to be planned weeks in advance because frozen soil could take days to thaw sufficiently for digging, while summer burials required immediate completion to prevent decomposition in hot weather. Rocky soil demanded different tools and techniques than clay or sandy conditions, and waterlogged ground created drainage challenges that required engineering knowledge as well as physical strength. But here's where medieval gravediggers become truly fascinating. They weren't just manual laborers but skilled craftsmen who belonged to professional guilds that regulated their work, maintained quality standards, and protected their economic interests. Gravedigger guilds established training requirements, pricing structures, and professional ethics that governed everything from grave dimensions to customer relations, creating organized trades that were essential to medieval urban life. The tools of medieval grave digging were sophisticated implements that represented centuries of technological development aimed at maximizing efficiency while minimizing physical strain. Different spade designs were optimized for various soil conditions, while specialized picks, mattocks, and crowbars could break through roots, rocks, and frozen ground that would defeat ordinary tools. The most skilled gravediggers crafted their own implements or worked with blacksmiths to create custom tools that gave them competitive advantages in difficult digging conditions. Grave measurement and layout required mathematical knowledge that ensured proper depth, width, and orientation according to religious requirements and practical considerations. About cemetery space utilization, medieval gravediggers understood geometry, drainage principles, and soil mechanics that allowed them to create stable excavations that wouldn't collapse during burial ceremonies or seasonal weather changes. The social aspects of medieval grave digging required diplomatic skills and emotional intelligence that were as important as physical strength and technical knowledge. Gravediggers worked directly with grieving families during their most vulnerable moments, requiring sensitivity and professionalism that could provide comfort while still maintaining the practical focus necessary to complete burial preparations efficiently. Religious coordination was essential because burial practices were governed by complex ecclesiastical requirements that varied between different Christian denominations and had to be followed precisely to ensure proper spiritual outcomes for the deceased. Gravediggers learned the specific requirements for different types of burials, from simple peasant interments to elaborate noble ceremonies that required weeks of preparation and coordination with multiple religious authorities. The economics of medieval grave digging created tiered service systems that provided different levels of burial quality based on families' ability to pay for premium services. Wealthy customers could afford deep graves with stone linings, elaborate drainage systems, and premium locations within consecrated cemetery grounds. Poor families received basic burial services that met minimum religious requirements, while keeping costs within reach of ordinary working people. Cemetery space management became increasingly complex as medieval cities grew, and burial grounds reached capacity limits that required careful planning and space allocation to serve community needs. Gravediggers developed techniques for maximizing cemetery utilization, including vertical stacking of graves, systematic reuse of older burial sites, and coordination with church authorities about expansion into new consecrated ground. The seasonal rhythms of medieval gravedigging created dramatic variations in workload and working conditions that required physical and psychological adaptation to periods of intense activity, alternating with relatively quiet times. Winter brought increased mortality from cold weather and seasonal diseases, while summer epidemic periods could overwhelm cemetery capacity and require emergency mass burial procedures. Spring brought the challenge of digging in waterlogged soil, as winter snow melted and groundwater levels rose, creating muddy conditions that made grave excavation difficult and dangerous. Autumn was often the busiest season, as harvest-related accidents, preparation for winter, and seasonal disease outbreaks combined to create peak demand for burial services. The health hazards associated with medieval grave digging were severe and required specialized knowledge about disease prevention and workplace safety that protected gravediggers from the occupational risks of constant exposure to decomposing bodies and contaminated soil. Gravediggers understood which diseases could be transmitted through contact with corpses and developed protective practices that reduced their risk of infection. Professional gravediggers learned to recognize signs of plague, cholera, and other epidemic diseases that required special burial procedures to prevent community contamination. They developed techniques for handling infected corpses, disinfecting tools and clothing, and protecting themselves from airborne contamination during mass burial operations that occurred during epidemic periods. The psychological challenges of daily exposure to death and human suffering required emotional coping strategies that allowed gravediggers to function effectively while maintaining their mental health and social relationships. Many gravediggers developed philosophical or religious frameworks that gave meaning to their work and helped them process the constant reminders of mortality that shaped their professional lives. Family relationships were often strained by the social stigma associated with grave digging and the practical challenges of maintaining normal domestic life while working in cemeteries surrounded by death and decay. Gravedigger families faced social isolation, economic uncertainty during slow periods, and the constant stress of knowing that their livelihood depended on human mortality and community tragedy. The training system for medieval gravediggers involved apprenticeships that combined technical skill development with psychological preparation for a career spent in constant contact with death and grieving families. Master gravediggers taught apprentices not just digging techniques and tool use, but also customer relations, religious protocols, and emotional management strategies that were essential for professional success. Guild training programs established standards for grave construction, cemetery maintenance, and professional conduct that protected both gravediggers and the communities they served. They created certification procedures that verified competency in technical skills, while ensuring that practitioners understood the social and religious responsibilities that came with their profession. Urban gravedigging faced unique challenges from population density, limited cemetery space, and municipal regulations that governed burial practices in crowded city environments where public health concerns required careful management of decomposing bodies and cemetery sanitation. City gravediggers developed specialized techniques for working in confined spaces, managing drainage in built-up areas, and coordinating with municipal authorities about public health requirements. Rural gravedigging served scattered populations across wide geographical areas, requiring travel between village cemeteries and adaptation to varying local customs and burial traditions. Rural gravediggers often served multiple communities and had to maintain relationships with different churches, families, and local authorities, while managing the practical challenges of working in remote locations with limited resources. The emergency procedures developed for epidemic periods when normal burial practices became impossible due to overwhelming mortality rates required gravediggers to abandon individual service in favor of mass burial operations that could handle dozens or hundreds of corpses efficiently while still maintaining minimum standards for human dignity and religious requirements. Plague periods created the ultimate test of gravedigger skills and endurance, as communities faced mortality rates that could overwhelm cemetery capacity within days or weeks. Gravediggers worked around the clock digging mass graves, organizing corpse transport, and maintaining burial records that tracked the dead even when individual ceremonies became impossible due to time and space constraints. The social respect earned by medieval gravediggers reflected community recognition that their work was essential for public health, religious observance, and social stability during both ordinary times and crisis periods. While they faced social stigma due to their association with death, they also earned gratitude from families who depended on their services and respect from authorities who understood their importance for community welfare. Professional gravediggers often expanded their services to include related activities like cemetery maintenance, monument construction, and funeral coordination that utilized their specialized knowledge and established relationships with families and religious authorities. Some became general contractors for death-related services who could manage all aspects of burial preparation and ceremony coordination. The decline of traditional grave-digging practices resulted from changes in burial customs, cemetery management, and urban development that reduced demand for individual gravedigger services while increasing mechanization and institutionalization of burial processes. However, many traditional techniques and professional practices continue to influence cemetery management and funeral services well into the modern period. Medieval grave-digging practices established precedents for modern cemetery management, funeral service delivery, and death care that continue to influence contemporary approaches to burial and commemoration. The emphasis on professional competence, dignified treatment of the dead, and sensitive customer service evolved directly from medieval gravedigger traditions. Most importantly, medieval gravediggers demonstrated that essential services can be provided with dignity and professionalism, even when the work involves society's most difficult and emotionally challenging tasks. They proved that technical competence, social sensitivity, and psychological resilience can combine to create meaningful careers that serve essential community needs, while maintaining personal and professional integrity. So what did a medieval gravedigger's daily life look like? It was a carefully organized routine that combined physical labor with technical expertise, customer service with religious observance, and individual craftsmanship with community responsibility. They worked as essential craftsmen who provided dignity for the dead while protecting the living from disease and despair, creating professional practices that balanced practical necessity with human compassion. They understood that their work was both physically demanding and socially essential, requiring technical skills and emotional intelligence that made them valuable community members, despite the social challenges associated with their profession. They proved that meaningful work can be found in even the most difficult circumstances when it serves genuine human needs and is performed with skill, dedication, and respect for those being served. The next time you visit a modern cemetery or appreciate the organized, dignified way that contemporary societies manage death and burial, remember the medieval gravedigger who rose before dawn to prepare graves in frozen ground, worked with hand tools and physical strength to create final resting places for community members, and provided essential services that kept medieval cities functioning during both ordinary times and crisis periods, when death overwhelmed normal community capacity. If you enjoy the hidden sides of medieval life, hit subscribe and give this video a like.